And I feel like it's sort of in line with how crazy sports have been. The other night, I was on the live stream with the guys from Political Football for the first round of the draft. We're not going to get into the first round of the draft. We will talk draft a little bit later. But one of the things I mentioned on that live stream, and I think you were there for a part of it, was how chaotic sports has been this year. Outside of the Kansas City Chiefs winning the Super Bowl, which was a pretty much, I think we all saw that coming or could see that coming as a reasonable outcome. Ever since then, though, it has been crazy. And right now, I think I'm going to make a statement, and I need your blessing on this. Right now, South Florida, specifically the Miami area, is the epicenter of sports right now.
That's a fair statement. That's a fair statement. It took me a minute. I was like, yeah, because the Marlins are terrible. But like, I would say yes, between the Panthers and obviously the Heat, 100%.
Which is amazing because that has not historically been a very heavy sports town. I mean, when you live in a place like that in Florida or California, sports is like this too. There's so much else to do. And going to a sporting event, especially an indoor sporting event, sometimes doesn't carry the same weight as doing literally anything else out there. But Miami right now is celebrating a lot. The Heat obviously limped into the playoffs and took out the number one seed. I think that's only happened like six times. And last night, the Freites family had what I have to be or has to be considered. It's a travesty. It's almost like a loss in the family. My father is a very big Boston sports fan. He has been for his entire life. He's 76 years old or almost 76. And the Boston Bruins had the best regular season in NHL history. That's not debatable. By the numbers, no matter how you slice it, it was amazing. And they lost last night, 4-3 to the eighth seed Florida Panthers. And my father has to be distraught. He's got to be downtrodden. And I don't know when I'll talk to him again. He'll probably come out of the doldrums of all of this. But in both of these particular cases, it made me think of something. It made me think of fandom. And you've actually talked to me offline before about the toxicity of fandom. And I want to play something for you. It's a clip you and I have both heard, but I want to play it for the listeners. And it's Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's probably one of the best players in the NBA. He was asked a very pointed question after their loss to the Heat eliminated them, and this is what he had to say.
Do you view this season as a failure?
Oh my God. You asked me the same question last year, Eric. Okay. Do you get the promotion every year on your job? No, right? So every year you work is a failure. Yes or no? No. Every year you work towards something, towards a goal, right? Which is to get a promotion, to be able to take care of your family, to be able, I don't know, provide the house for them or take care of your parents. You work towards a goal. It's not a failure. It's steps to success. Michael Jordan played 15 years, won 6 championships. The other 9 years was a failure. That's what you're telling me. No, I'm asking you a question. Yes or no? Okay, exactly. So why you asking me that question? It's a wrong question. There's no failure in sports.
This is not specific to any fan base, but I think it happens a lot in these fan bases that are not satisfied with winning. The Bucks just won a championship 2 years ago. Boston has seen a litany of championships, and yet today, fan bases from both of those sides are probably calling for somebody's head, whether it's the coach, whether it's the player, the GM, whatever. And I wanted to get into a philosophical discussion with you about fandom, the toxicity of fandom, and whether we as fans are entitled to shit.
Well, first of all, I want to give you credit for pronouncing his last name expertly. There is zero way I would have gotten through that successfully. So kudos to you. I love talking about fandom. It's such an interesting topic. And first and foremost, I think there's something very romantic about being a passionate sports fan. And the stupid movie Fever Pitch with Jimmy Fallon and how obsessed he is with the Red Sox, which I'm sure you're very familiar with growing up in the Northeast. Obviously, some of the things that he's involved with, they're a little extreme, but those things do exist out there in the world. And I think that the reason people are so passionate about sports is it is a distraction from everyday life. It's something that it's almost like being in a relationship. I mean, you love this thing, but in a weird way, unlike another person, the only way they can reciprocate you is by, I guess, winning and you being able to go along for the ride as a fan. That being said, I do believe that we as fans get a little too invested and let it impact our day-to-day lives in different ways. Especially, if you want to be depressed because your team lost or lost a big series or lost a championship, you want to be bummed out about it for a day or two. I think that's fair. But at the point where you see people going at some of these players, coaches, executives in a very personal way, as if they owe them something, as if they weren't out there trying their absolute best to win. as if they themselves could have done better. I do think that's ridiculous. It's very strange when you think about it. You see people chastising professional athletes the same way that they're yelling at the manager at McDonald's when they screw their order up. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised by that this day and age. I don't want to focus so much on the negative but there is a lot of it. But really, initially, I just want to say I do think, like I said at the beginning, there is something very romantic about being a sports fan and being invested in something that you don't have any control over, as long as you can manage to do it in a healthy way.
I firmly agree with you on that. And I think that being a fan can be very, very healthy. Having a rooting interest in a team that you're emotionally attached to, there's nothing wrong with that. But when I hear questions like this, now I don't want to put this reporter on blast here because this reporter is doing their job. They're asking what I consider a fair question at the end of the day. Because if you're the number one seed in any professional sport, the expectations are that you're going to be vying for the championship, even if you don't win it. And if you have a historic season and you lose in this kind of fashion, it is embarrassing. And I think that it's at least warranted to ask questions like this. But what I wanted to ask you is where is the line? Because you talked about a healthy relationship with the team. And I wonder to myself sometimes if we, the fans, feel as if we own more of the team than we actually do, because there's something about that we are passionately into it. And so therefore we care more and we feel as if these teams and these executives should care as much as we do. But if you think about all the people in the fan base, there's no way that they could placate to all of that because fans are emotional, people are emotional. And I do wonder if the criticism is fair at times. Like today, right now in Boston, is it fair after the season that they had to get up, call WEEI, and call in and say that the team sucks and they're a failure? I understand they didn't win the Stanley Cup, but they had an excellent season by literally every other metric. And for me, I feel like when you don't remember how hard it is to win, it's very, very difficult. Regular season success is one thing, do it in the playoffs is another thing. And we've seen countless teams falter in the playoffs and not be able to get to the promised land because only one team gets to do it every year. I wanted to get your thoughts on that part of it.
Well, these are the best athletes in the world, right? Playing at the highest level, and this is their profession. This is their livelihood. And yeah, we could argue and debate maybe another day if they're overpaid for what they do and whatever. But the reality is that they get paid a lot of money. They're very successful, and I do think that, sure, there are certainly athletes that get to a point where they do look at it as more of a job than maybe the having being driven by the passion of winning championships. From a fan's perspective, I think, the line in the sand is when it becomes personal. You're totally, I think, entitled to feel however you want to feel, but when it comes to taking personal shots at members of the organization, I do have a problem with that. And then the counter argument might be, well, with the amount of money they're making, so on and so forth, that's what they've opened themselves up for. But I think you could be critical without being demeaning, rude, derogatory, any of those things. And at the same time, I think fans are an important part of an organization. And obviously, you can't placate everybody, and you shouldn't. But fans are very important from a financial standpoint, for one, buying tickets, buying merchandise, but also from a cultural standpoint. I think that you have some of these fan bases that have sort of taken on a life of their own. You think like Bills Mafia, the black hole with the Raiders, some of that, they've taken on this persona and it's just become part of the culture and the environment that surrounds the team. The terrible towel in Pittsburgh, and we could go on all day long about different ones, but it's very important. And I do think that franchises have to, they have an obligation to try to put the best product on the field to be successful. I think that's, from a front office point, that's their obligation to the fans. But when we could debate what happens when that doesn't seem to be the case. But overall, when it becomes personal, where you're taking personal attacks, personal shots at members of the organization, I think that's where it's an issue. You want to call the radio show and say, "Hey, I'm really unhappy with this. I wish that management would have done this differently, that differently." I think that's fair. But to call the season a failure after what you said, a historically great season by all accounts, probably a number of franchises would trade places with the Bruins in a second if they could. And, but Boston's had, they've had a really good few decades here of sports. And like you said, they've almost forgotten how hard it is to win and to be the successful.
I have such an issue with Boston sports fans, and I want to say this out front that I am one of you. I love my Boston sports teams, or at least the Red Sox and the Patriots. I don't really follow the Celtics or the Bruins all that much. I'm more of a global fan of the NBA and a global fan of hockey because I just love playoff hockey. But you're right though, they have forgotten what it's like to be losers. Boston for a really long time were lovable losers, actually not even that lovable in some ways. but they were losers regardless. And the Cubs fans know everything about that and how long it took to bring glory to the city of Chicago, at least part of it anyway. And just because there's been a lot of success doesn't mean that there is a lot of failure. I mean, yes, you're going to go through periods where you're not going to win, but Giannis being asked that question and being a foreign player, being the best player out there, playing hurt, to be asked that question, I understand why he's frustrated. And that's one part of sports that's so fascinating. You and I have a bad day at work. We go home, you pour a glass of whiskey, whatever your vice is, you podcast like we do, and you go about your day. The next day, it resets. When Giannis gets off the court, he's got a microphone shoved into his face and he has to answer to his bad game or his team's bad game or his coach's poor decision making or what have you. And it's just such a unique situation. And we haven't yet found that happy medium to where these players can have a little bit of a cool off. And I know a lot of people were saying, like, well, they were failures because they didn't make the finals. And I'm like, they just won the championship 2 years ago. When did we become such what have you done for me lately in sports, especially with these franchises that haven't seen success in forever? Like forever. Like are Cubs fans turning into this now? Are Cubs fans going to all of a sudden become, well, the team stinks because we haven't won since 2017 when they went 100 years without winning it?
I do think there are some pretty disgruntled Cubs fans. My father being one of them here a couple years ago when they offloaded all the guys that were part of that team, Anthony Rizzo, Chris Bryant, so on. My dad basically swore off the Cubs when that happened. He's like, they're not even trying to win. This is ridiculous. And, and I'm sure there are people in the Chicago area that are just the same. But I do think that there are a few cities around this country where the passion about sports from a fan perspective is on another level. Chicago is one of those cities. I think Boston, New York to some degree, Philadelphia, like places like that. I think, you say Buffalo and we're talking Bills, but just the intensity, the passion that comes from those fan bases in those cities is absolutely insane. You don't hear, now I get that, and I'm gonna pull in a perfect INC moment here, but Giannis still plays for the Bucks, right?
Yes.
Okay, I was like, so Milwaukee isn't one of those cities you wouldn't think necessarily where you would consider them to be a highly passionate fans. I mean, I'm sure they are, but compared to those other cities, they're not. But you're not going to hear questions like that so much in like LA or Denver, some of these other places, Seattle. There's just even the media is probably a little softer in those places than you'd get in some of these more, I don't know, passionate cities, for lack of a better term.
Do you think that it's fair that these cities actually do dictate how some of these attitudes come about? Because Milwaukee, as you pointed out, they got the Brewers, they got the Bucks, and really they don't have four professional teams there, at least as far as I know that they don't. And I don't ever find either of those fan bases to be super, super passionate. I mean, the Bucks were really bad for a while, the Brewers were really bad for a while, and you kind of have those ebbs and flows. And right now, the Bucks have one of the best players of our generation, of our lifetime, basically playing for them, and they're probably going to be in contention for a while. It's just amazing how winning changes all of that. But I do believe that the narrative of the media changes it a lot too, because when you're in Boston and you have such a mainstay in WEEI and you listen, and the people that are on the radio station are so negative about the team. I remember my father, every time I go visit him, and he's kind of like your dad. Like I was going to ask, does anything make your dad happy in sports outside of Bradley basketball? Because he's sworn off the NFL, he's sworn off the Cubs. Anything else we need to add to the list?
Not that I can think of at this moment, but, I tell you what, talking about fathers in this situation, and fans, it kind of fits within this. It's outside of pro sports, but we've talked about wrestling a little bit here. We talked a little bit when we were leading up to the national tournament. There's a young man that wrestled for Iowa for the last 6 years with COVID and his injuries named Spencer Lee, and he was a three-time national champion. He got beat this year on his, quest for a fourth. Has always been regarded coming out of high school as one of the best wrestlers in the country and was sort of expected to go to college, win 4 national championships, go to the Olympics, win a couple gold medals. But he's been plagued by injuries ever since his junior year of high school. I mean, he wrestled his senior year of high school with one torn ACL, won the national championship his sophomore year of college with 0 ACLs. Both of them were torn. Has battled shoulder surgeries, everything else. So, anyways, after he got beat at the national wrestling tournament this year, NCAA's, he medically forfeited out of the tournament because he just couldn't continue. And people, when this happened, went at his parents, and his parents have been. I mean, I'm talking Iowa fans, like verbally assaulted his mom and dad at the arena. at the hotel, and these people are like the biggest cheerleaders for Iowa wrestling, Iowa sports, Iowa everything, and just the nicest people, as far as I can tell, by all accounts. The reason I found this out is the U.S. Open just happened, which is a one of the pathways to qualifying for the world team that lets you compete for the Olympic team and so on. Spencer Lee entered it to compete for a spot, and he won his first few matches. And then it said like he was going to be in like the semifinals, and news release came out that said Spencer Lee has withdrawn from the U.S. Open because of injuries, like can't compete. So there's an outlet called Flow Wrestling that does great wrestling coverage, and they did an interview with his father, Larry, a 20-minute interview, and his dad basically like lays all this out there that none of us really knew, and talked about how, him and his wife were being verbally accosted by people, by fans, like you said, at the arena, back at the hotel. I mean, I guess it was so bad that his mom has said that, she didn't even come to the US Open. She's like, it's too soon. Like, and he probably shouldn't have competed, but he was hoping he could skate by, win the US Open, and then he would have a break for a while before he'd have to compete again and maybe get healthy. And it just didn't work out. And they talk about how his parents, it's so hard because you've watched a kid that has done everything to try to succeed and just has had really terrible luck with injuries. And they say, especially when it comes to something like wrestling, as opposed to maybe your big time football players. So like these guys go to, fans don't know what these guys are going through on a daily basis. Like these guys actually go to class every day. They might have been up till 3 o'clock in the morning studying for a big exam. Maybe there was a kid that went out and wrestled the next day, like his mom died the day before or something like that. And he went out the next day, wrestled, didn't wrestle very well, and the fans were letting him have it on all the message boards and social media. And he's like, people just don't realize these are kids that are putting it out there. You have no idea what they're going through. How do you feel so entitled to sit there and attack them in the way that you're doing? And obviously, it's a little different at the professional level than at the college level. But I think it kind of speaks to the craziness that does come along with some fans for sure.
But is it really different though? Philosophically, is it different? They're still human
No,
beings. They're getting paid a lot of money. I remember listening to a hockey podcast. This is probably last year when listening to other sports shows to try to get a flavor of what other people are doing. And it was a Canadian guy who was doing a hockey show, and he talked about how for his team, I can't remember what team it was. One of the guys had missed a couple of games because his wife had their first child. And he said, I know I'm going to get flack for this, but he should not have missed that time. Like you know that you got to be there for this game. You can't be having kids. And I'm like, yo, like you can't be saying that kind of stuff. Like these are real people just because they're athletes and they get paid money. And don't forget, not every single athlete is getting paid the max contract in whatever sport they're playing. There's a lot of guys who are trying to just make it, they're trying to continue to be in the league and be relevant. And we talked offline about Drew Maggi, I think, for the Pirates and how 33 years old, guy finally gets called up to the majors. And that guy's not making millions. He's not all of a sudden living this cush lifestyle. So what? Is he supposed to stop having a life because you feel that the team is more important? It's just weird how some of this stuff has come about. And you're 100% right. If you're a fan who has verbally accosted somebody, no matter where you've seen them, or you have tried to do something because you are not happy with their play in the field and all that, then you really need to stop being a fan of sports. It's not healthy for you. You should not be allowed to be around these people. Because again, are there asshole athletes there? Of course there are. Are there asshole owners and organizations? Of course there are. Not every team is going to meet your expectations. Not every team is going to win the championship every single year. Take what you can get because at its core, sports is wonderful. And these kinds of things, they ruin it for me. They ruin the good stories. The Florida Panthers should be the story. The Miami Heat should be the story, not Giannis and whether it was a failure. The Miami Heat turned it on in the playoffs. Earlier this month or last month, remember I asked the question about whether upsets are a little cliche now? This is what sports is all about. These stories of the engine that could, Jimmy Butler all of a sudden turning it on, willing a team that had been mediocre all year to the playoffs into a playoff victory, and they look like they could go to the NBA Finals. And the Florida Panthers, a team, again, that figured out how to win halfway through the season and has a historic upset. They will always be remembered. That's what sports is all about, and we should remember that.
And when we think about sports history, what are some of the greatest sports stories you can think of? They're the comebacks, they're the underdogs, right? The upsets. Other than the only ones that don't fit in that category that are really popular are like teams that were just extraordinarily dominant. Other than that, it's the underdog stories. The Red Sox coming back against the Yankees being down 3-0 and to win in 7 and go to the World Series and finally get it done. Those types of stories, and or the Cubs finally getting over the hump and stuff like that. Those are the things that everyone remembers. And I love upsets. I love upsets. I love underdogs, and like it's like they say, that's why you play the game, right? That's why you go out there and play the game to begin with. If it was played on paper, based off this seed, this is the higher seeded team or whatever. I mean, it'd be a waste of time. And when I talk about verbally accosting, I'm not. I want to make it clear, like I am not opposed to a good ribbing of the opposing team or opposing players within the boundaries of proper decorum, which I'm sure are not followed everywhere. But I love some good trash talk, and I'm all about that. It's just when you have fans that will turn coat on their own team in a second based off the outcome of a single game or series, that's just embarrassing, truthfully. I mean, in most cases, you're a grown adult and you should behave like one. And I don't know. I just be better, do better.